What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Level 10 YouTube page. We have Coach John, Coach Brad, Coach Shelby, Coach Tori, and Coach Tom back to talk about training again. The first two videos that we had talked about were kind of about how to structure your training and the different elements that are incorporated in them. And today we just want to briefly chat about some ways that you can ramp up the intensity within your training sessions, some techniques to make them a little bit more challenging and to put forth a little bit more effort and potentially get a little bit more results, get a little bit more out of your training sessions. So we're kind of just going to go around the room here and talk about some of our favorite strategies and techniques to do that. So if you're one of my clients listening to this, you've likely seen this before. My favorite intensity technique is something called myo reps, where we are essentially creating or achieving or performing the most amount of effective reps possible in a very short period of time by preemptively fatiguing our target musculature and resting for a very minimal amount of time and continually performing repetitions at a very, very close approximation to failure. And actually for most of the reps that we're doing, they're all taking them all the way to failure. So essentially the goal is to be training in a fatigued state as consistently as possible to make sure that each one of the repetitions that you are performing is as stimulative as it possibly can be. So like I had mentioned, we are creating that fatigue at the beginning of each myo rep set by performing an exercise to a close approximation to failure. Typically, I like to program these somewhere in the 10 to 20 rep range. And I have your what I call activation set be the first set that you perform, and you intentionally stop with about 2 reps in reserve, meaning it's challenging, it's close to failure, but you could do a couple more. You stop that set, and then you rest for only 10 to 15 seconds. Usually it's about 3 to 5 deep breaths. And then you go right back into it and you perform that same exercise again, but this time it's all the way to muscular failure. You stop, take 3 to 5 deep breaths again, 10 to 15 seconds, and you repeat either until you can no longer match the amount of reps that you performed in that second set or kind of like the first cluster set, or you can set a, ahead of time, I'm going to do 5 mini sets or 4 mini sets, whatever that may be. But essentially, again, what you are ensuring is that all of the reps that you are performing after that activation set are at a high level of effort or at a very close approximation to failure, meaning you are recruiting the most amount of motor units possible and just essentially making them effective reps for growth, for hypertrophy, and for general adaptation. So that's a simple way to kind of take an exercise that you might already be doing. Usually it's one that you'd want to be really comfortable with, really proficient with, maybe using machines so you don't have to worry about stability, but get a lot of effective work in a very small period of time. Might make sense for Shelby to kind of go next. I mean, yours is going to kind of play off of, mine incorporates AMRAPs, and those cluster sets are going all the way to failure. So doing as many reps as you possibly can. So that kind of leads into one of your favorite techniques.
Yeah, so one of my favorite techniques to utilize is called an EMOM. EMOM is an acronym for either every minute on the minute or even minute odd minute. In this scenario, I'm going to be talking about it as an every minute on the minute. Essentially what that means is at the top of every minute. So when the clock hits 0, right, whether it's starting 0, 0, 0, or like the 1 minute, 2 minute mark, you're going to be starting your next wave of work. This is something that you're not going to do with necessarily super heavy loads most of the time. This is going to be more of like your moderate loading. And it again is about getting in a lot of work in a shorter amount of time. So the goal typically is not to be working the entirety of the minute. You want to be working maybe somewhere in a 30 to 45 second range for the amount of reps and load that you're using, and then leaving 10 to 15 seconds or so left in that minute. That is your recovery before you start again. This can be utilized for cardiovascular work. This can be utilized for strength, again, kind of reaching that fatigue similar to myo reps, where you are wanting to get to that point of it's mechanically difficult to continue, but giving you just that 10 to 15 second break allows you to go again and have that same intensity. Just like John said, you're going to be recruiting more muscle fibers typically at that point because you're having to work harder to get the work done. another version of this that I actually like to utilize, if you're someone who is doing, let's say, moderate to heavy strength work, you can manipulate your EMOMs to be more like an every 2 minutes or every 3 minutes or every 4 minutes on the minute with your strength work. So to make sure you are getting in enough rest, but maybe not the full 2 to 5 minutes you would do for your moderate to heavy loads. So for my friends and family who like to do the 85, 90% ranges, hit your less reps, right? Like 5 to 6 reps, maybe into 3s, because you don't like to do a lot of reps, which is my preference. You can utilize an EMOM to keep you on track, but maybe shorten your rest periods just a little bit. So again, keeping it more challenging. For example, doing back squats, a set of 5 at an 80 to 85% range, which should be pretty doable, but doing it maybe every 2.5 minutes or every 3 minutes. So it's not quite as much rest time as you would typically do in a strength block. So you're getting in some heavy work while you're already still a little bit fatigued from your previous set. So those are the two strategies I typically use it for, is keeping you kind of to your rest periods and a little bit shorter than a typical strength rest period for your heavy main compound lifts, or utilizing it to get your heart rate up and work at that kind of, light to moderate loading and having to work harder and challenge yourself a little bit more to get more reps in.
Yeah, I think both of those come to basically the same place at the end of the day, but that way of increasing intensity is essentially limiting total rest time, which again, the myo reps also do as well. But the myo rep technique is essentially to ensure that you are training close to failure every single rep. So that's the main goal and intention. Yours is the reducing rest times. But again, you get to the same, it's more intense work, no matter how you look at it.
Right. Yeah. And then EMOM, typically we're not trying to get to failure, though. It should be like still more of that like RPE 8 or 9. You get just enough rest where, again, you can hit another set at an RPE 8 to 9.
Tori, do you want to go ahead and go next? I mean, I think talking about rest periods and how that can differ in terms of intensity can kind of lead into what you were going to talk about now. So I think that's a nice flow.
Yeah, absolutely. So in tandem with some of those things, a metric that you might be paying attention to or might not, depending on your training capacity, is heart rate. And there are a few different ways that you can use heart rate to measure and manipulate intensity of your workouts. And this depends on if you are doing something in a more aerobic capacity or an anaerobic capacity. So if you are weight training, your heart rates are going to look a little bit different than if you are cardiovascular training. So in general, there are 5 different heart rate zones, and you want to, ideally, a well-rounded training plan, whether that has, some elements of cardio in it or is, primarily weight training, operates in several of those different heart rate zones. So zones 1 and 2 are lower heart rate zones. This is within about 50 to 70% of your maximum heart rate. And most people don't know off the top of their head what their maximum heart rate is. A quick equation that you can use is 220 minus your age. So if you are, 35, 220 minus 35 is 185. So that would be ideally your maximum heart rate. The other way that you can test it is by field testing. So you can either run up a hill or run up some stairs, or you can, run sprints and do that about 3 times and kind of see how high you can get your heart rate zone, and add maybe give or take 10 beats per minute on top of whatever maximum heart rate that you see, to gauge roughly where your maximum heart rate is going to be. So you can also use this for things like AMRAP. So if you were trying to estimate using either rating of perceived exertion or your heart rate to see how intense that AMRAP is feeling. So if you're trying to get as many rounds as possible in 20 minutes, maybe the highest heart rate that you see, or that your Oura Ring or your Apple Watch or Fitbit or whatever heart rate monitor that you're using, whatever that says, the highest amount, that's something that you can gauge over time. Ideally, if you improve your aerobic capacity, if you're able to get more conditioned, you should see fluctuations in those heart rates, and maybe even see an increase in maximum heart rate over time. So that's another way that you can kind of gauge intensity of your workouts. And for the rest of the heart rate zones, so zones 1 and 2, which is about 70% or less of your maximum heart rate, that's going to be kind of your fat burning zone. So this is going to be exercise that you can sustain for long durations of time. Moderate heart rate zone, or like kind of the mid range, is going to be that 70 to 80% capacity. So it's going to be difficult work that you're not going to be able to sustain forever, but it's more like a brisk jog. So if you're doing tempo runs, if you're training for a half marathon or a marathon, you might be in this heart rate zone for a long duration of time. When you get into more the 80 to 100%, the zone 4, zone 5 cardio zones, that's where you're going to be doing maximum effort. So if you're doing HIIT training, if you are doing AMRAPs, your heart rate's probably going to range a little bit closer to there, but obviously you cannot sustain that for long durations of time. So it helps to work in shorter time durations, which is why AMRAPs are not 45 minutes long. It's why AMRAPs are typically 15 to 20 minutes long. And so keeping an eye on your heart rate and using that as another piece of data can be a way to measure intensity of your workouts.
Kind of like how you mentioned, a good way to gauge them over time. In using
Yes.
myo reps, you can gauge like, okay, is my performance increasing? Am I able to perform more reps per set, meaning my output is improving? Then that you're progressing. With an EMOM, are you able to complete your target work in a shorter period of time and thus have more rest in every minute? You know that you're getting better. If you're doing the same amount of work and running the same duration or whatever, and your heart rate doesn't get as high or as elevated, you know that your capacity is now improving, right? So there's all different ways to also use these metrics to gauge your progression and how you are adapting as well.
I think something to remember with that is, as you talked about, shorter duration with the higher intensity, that also goes for your total amount of time you are performing these throughout your week, that you don't need to be doing, HIIT training necessarily every single day, that it's good for you to spend time in zone 2 training, for example, is really shown to be very beneficial for overall cardiovascular health. So it's good for you to do 1 to 2 days of that zone 2 that may not feel super difficult, but long duration is fantastic for things like keeping your heart rate from elevating during even the higher intensity work. And then the high intensity work you can do, maybe once a week, maybe twice a week, but you don't need to be doing that 4, 5, 6 times a week to still reap the benefits, because that short duration work is plenty.
And then switching gears back to specifically talking about, strength and resistance training, like weight training. Brad and Tom have 2 more kind of like specific programming tactics or strategies that you can utilize in your, in the gym or at home, whatever resistance training you're doing to, take that to the next level. So Brad, if you want to go ahead with what you were going to bring up.
Yeah, so 2 things kind of mixed together a little bit, but overall tempo of our lifts, and then also kind of paused or isometric work. Essentially, when we think about doing work, anything in a mechanical perspective, it's a combination of how far the weight has to move and how much weight you're using. And so if you're thinking about someone in a back squat, if they're going through full range of motion, they're essentially maximizing the distance that they have to move the weight. And so the easiest way to increase force output or force required by the muscle is to add weight. But you can't, once you get to a heavier, once you start becoming more trained, it's hard to just add more weight consistently. Even if you're adding small increments, you get to a point to where you start to reduce the amount of reps that you can do. And so if you're trying to find another way to increase intensity, things like pause work is really useful, because when you do a normal squat, not only is the muscle contracting to lift the weight back up, but you also have 2 components called your passive and elastic components of the muscle itself. And so when the muscle is stretched like a rubber band, it naturally wants to return to its normal state, and that helps increase or lift the weight in that concentric phase. We also have things in our muscle called muscle spindles that, as the muscle is stretched, they actually cause contraction of the muscle itself, separate from the muscle fibers, and they all relate to kind of concentric muscle actions. However, when we throw in a pause, we reduce that elastic component of the connective tissue that surrounds the muscle, and so it actually requires more force output by the myofilaments directly in the muscle. And so if we're trying to increase the intensity that the muscle has to do, pausing to reduce some of that elastic component increases the force output. And so I often use the example of if you go for a vertical jump, you typically do a fast eccentric and then a quick concentric to maximize power output. And that's why it's much harder if I ask you to pause at the bottom before you jump, because we've just taken all that elastic component out, and now we have to provide more force from the specific contractile proteins. Tempo work, kind of in addition to that, is essentially if we're slowing down that eccentric. So again, if on a squat we're going down slower, that's just another way of reducing the elastic component or that reflexive response, and then increasing the duration that the actual contractile proteins have to provide force. And so whether it's making very small jumps in weights, that's a way to increase intensity. But if you can't necessarily do that, if we're thinking about gauging progress over time, is, maybe you're on a bench press and you have to do all touch and go at a certain weight. If over time you can start to do some pause sets with that, even at the same weight, you have just now shown you can generate more force from the muscle itself. And that would be another way that we can gauge progress while also increasing intensity.
I think you can go really in depth with tempo work and how people view time under tension and what that means relative to hypertrophy, relative to strength, and like what you were talking about with all of those other components of the muscle itself in terms of like the length tension relationship, and how there can even be some benefits to just being under load in that fully lengthened position for a longer duration of time. I think I just recently saw somebody talking about, I think it's getting bigger in the industry now that in terms of hypertrophy, people will say that, hey, it's probably beneficial for you to, even if you're not even performing the concentric portion of the movement, just being under load, under stress in a lengthened position might actually lead to some positive adaptation. So just adding a pause in there technically does add more time under that, effective and sufficient tension. So that's another way to look at it too.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would say in addition to that as well is, I think one area where I've seen my clients mess up is like if we're pausing on a bench press, they let the weight sink down into them and let their sternum and their body support the weight, when really in a true pause, you're still generating that force output in an isometric action and then doing the concentric. And so rather than just letting it dip in and hold there, you're actually still holding it with that force to maximize, like you said, that time under tension.
Yeah, it's funny because it's called passive tension, right? But it really is, it should be, you're still being active, you're not just letting go, like you said. So it is a passive component, but it's an active action with what you're actually doing.
Yes.
I tell people the analogy I utilize is if you were in sports of any kind, like when you were younger, or if you've ever done the like bring Sally up challenge with squats or anything, that typically if you have great range of motion and like mobility, right, you can sit in a bottom squat all day and it's
just
passive,
sit there.
right? But that's not what we're doing. And so coaches would always like, not necessarily do bring Sally up, but like if we were doing some kind of like sitting in a squat or a wall sit, they would make us come up just slightly because it would make sure that we were being active in it, not just like hanging out in it. But you can't sit in the bottom and have nothing there. Plus, that's also not necessarily the safest if you've got load like on your back or whatever, trying to get that up after basically having no tension. So safety wise, also good.
There should be a cutoff, because the whole point of Brad talking about that was so that you're required to generate more force on the musculature that you're actually targeting. And if you're coming all the way out of that muscle's active range of motion to start you like in that squat coming back up, you're likely going to be using like your spinal erectors instead of your actual, your quads or your glutes. And so you want to be going all the way through to the fully lengthened position of your targeted musculature that's going to be active through that concentric.
Right.
And then Tom, you can go ahead and talk about another technique to kind of structure your training to, again, just get a little bit more out of it, or just kind of make it a little bit that much more effective.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about percentages. So when we think of percentages, it's just a way to modulate intensity of your sets as you go. To break it down in the most simplest way, let's say we're just focusing on strength work here. So your big 3 lifts, your dead, squats, bench, which a lot of power lifters will use percentage-based training anyway. Let's just say your 1 rep max is 100 pounds. You want to know how much weight should I use, if I'm going to do 4x4 or 5x5 or 4x6, what have you. You just do the percentage, and there's a whole chart that you can find online. NSCA has one. Looking at it right now. So if I was going to do 4x4 and I wanted to do 90% of my 1RM, I would do 90 pounds. So it's just a way to help you modulate intensity. There's pros to it because, one, it's telling you what weight to use, so it takes a lot of the thinking out of it, and it's fairly accurate. The con is it doesn't account for all the outside factors, biofeedback, things like that. So there's no reps in reserve to it. So if I walked in the gym and I had a really crappy night's sleep, I was underfed, underhydrated, I went to do my 4x4 at 90%. The only problem is I might not have it in me to get that 90%. But I tell any client I give percentage stuff to, or anyone that uses it, I say use it as more of a guide. It should kind of be a starting point for your day, or if there's no way I'm getting that weight, you could at least try that load and then back off on your subsequent sets. And it's very easy to lay out a program, weeks in advance and say, these are the percentages you should be shooting for as you go. Because in theory, like, let's say I did my 4x4 at 90%, each passing week I should get a little bit stronger. So I could go to 91%, I could go to 92%, I could go to 93 as weeks go by. So it's just one way to gauge or modulate your intensity of your workouts. I've used it in the past. I personally still prefer RPE or RIR compared to percentages for the reasons that I laid out. But it is something that you'll see people use. You'll see powerlifting programs have a lot of percentages. So.
Yeah, I use it as well, but I like that you talk about the one downfall, like where percentages fail, is that if it doesn't have like a RPE or RIR component with it, then it's kind of like, well, what do you do? So I like to try and explain the purpose of that percentage. Like if you're aiming to use 90% for multiple reps, then the goal is obviously to be training sub maximally. So if you, like you said, you got a terrible night's sleep or whatever, and you go in and that 90%, you're aiming for 4, and you're like, man, that first rep was slow, I might fail at 2. Then we know we need to back off the weight, because the goal is not to be, at failure. The goal is to be training sub-maximally. 90% shouldn't be. And then also there's always so many individual differences, because I've seen people who, like, you give them 90% and maybe they can only do 4 reps, and that's typical for them. But you give somebody else 90% and they can do like 8 or to 10 reps with that. And it's just, it's strange, but there are those differences between people. Like the percentage doesn't necessarily just give you, well, that's going to be 1 rep in reserve, that's going to be 2. So if you kind of have those paired together, it allows you to, serve the main purpose, which is, like you said, modulate and regulate intensity over time.
And the further away you get from one rep, so the higher the rep goes, the less accurate, I believe, is what I've heard in the past. At least, Brad, you could probably attest to this. The higher, so like when you get to 9 reps, it's 77%. That's even more variability in there. It's just different for everybody.
I think that's the one that I was actually thinking about, that like the differences is like wild between like how many reps people can do with 77 or 75%.
Yeah. And then it's just like, in your example, if someone's truly their max is 100 pounds, like, the range that they have to go from a 1 rep max to a 3 rep max is like 3.5 pounds, 4 pounds. And so you have one bad rep, and now you're estimating off of a bad number, to where as you get to that greater load, then you can really start to know, okay, 10-pound jump, 5-pound. And so there's just more variability there. And then also kind of what you said about, the biofeedback, the reverse is also true. So the research shows that as people get more experience with RIR or RPE, percentages actually sometimes hold them back. If they're feeling great and having a great training day, and you're supposed to do, a 4 at whatever percentage, when in reality, you could actually do an extra 10 to 15 pounds because you're feeling good, percentages actually kind of limit maximizing your good training days.
Interesting.
I want to say that that it's juggernaut maybe that also kind of takes into account, the juggernaut method takes into account your energy for the day along with it. And I don't remember the specifics because they kind of all run together in my head, but it's similar with using percentages, but also allowing for like at your higher percentages, including things like an AMRAP, so that if you do feel good, you can push, which allows you to have a little bit more control over it as well with the days that you are feeling great versus the days you're not feeling so hot.
Yeah, all this to say that while it has its fallbacks, it's still better than not having some kind of a guide. So don't think that it's trash based on what we're saying. It's just understand how to apply it as opposed to just, winging it.
I mean, I think it was good to like have that be at the end anyway, to also remind people that like some of the things that we talked about, like the EMOMs, the AMRAPs, the myoreps and whatnot, those are techniques to, in certain points in time in your programming, ramp up the intensity. It's not necessarily how we recommend, it's not how we recommend training all of the time. Like a percentage-based program is purposeful because it helps you, like Tom said, modulate and regulate your intensity over time so that you're not always just going all the way out, or like all the way. You're not going, to failure or doing AMRAPs every single time, because that's not going to be a very effective program. So these are ways to ramp up that intensity when it makes sense to do so. And that's usually towards the end of a training block, or, every once in a while, if you are feeling fantastic that day or something like that. But, going back and listening to those first 2 videos that we did on training will give you a better idea of how your training should look most of the time. And then this is a way to just like add that extra 1% sometimes every once in a while.
Yeah, remember that these are not the standard or the norm. This is the additional work once you've built the foundation in those primary techniques that we know are tried and true and work.
Right. Anyone have anything else to add before we kind of just close it up? I mean, I already mentioned the last 2 videos, so if there are any last remarks. If anybody is listening to this, made it all the way through, and you have any questions, always feel free to drop those down in the comments, and we keep an eye on that. We can answer them there. You can obviously send us a message on through email. Check out our website. Look at any of our Instagrams. We're all pretty active on there. We always do respond to questions that we get on our posts and our DMs and things like that. So make sure to check out the rest of the other videos. And as always, look out for the new stuff that we're putting out too, because we don't just talk about training. We have videos on stress, on things like your guts and things like dieting in general. So look out for more from the Level 10 page. Check out all of the social aspects, our website and whatnot. Like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff. And we'll talk to you guys in the next one.